Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're exploring the incredible story of a nation. Its ancient roots stretch back further than the Great Pyramid of Giza, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Yet its modern identity is just so dynamically shaped by layers of conflict, innovation, and, well, amazing resilience.
That's right. We're talking about Ireland, a land whose history, spanning over 12,000 years is just as captivating as its dramatic landscapes.
Yeah?
Our mission today is really to unpack its incredibly complex past. We'll focus on the key events, the profound cultural shifts, and those pivotal political developments that have really forged this nation.
And we've gathered a really rich stack of sources for this deep dive. We're going to try and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and hopefully some surprising facts for you. The goal really is to help you understand the why behind so much of what you see in Ireland today. We'll be covering a huge timeline from its very first prehistoric settlements all the way up to its, thriving modern role in the European Union. So let's get started. If we travel way back to the dawn of time in Ireland, our sources tell us that the island's been inhabited since around 8,000 BC. Is that right?
That's about right, yeah. These earliest known inhabitants were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They arrived after the last ice age, settling mostly along the coasts.
Right. And what do we know about their daily lives? Must have been tough.
Oh, definitely. But they had a fascinating way of life. Imagine them hunting reindeer, boar, fishing for salmon and eel in the rivers.
Wow.
Gathering nuts and berries and, expertly carving tools from flint, bone, wood. They left traces behind, like shell middens.
Shell middens, like old garbage heaps.
Basically, yeah. Ancient refuse heaps, often full of shells. And we also find remains of circular wooden houses. It gives us a unique glimpse into their early existence.
And then things change. Around 4000 BC, we see the Neolithic Revolution arrive.
Exactly. Farming people is coming over from Britain, bringing agriculture, pottery, and more permanent structures, stone, wood, earth houses.
But what really stands out from this era, for me anyway, are those megalithic wonders they left behind. Incredible stuff.
Absolutely incredible. These people built massive megalithic tombs, which served as communal graves. The grand structures at Brunaboyne in County Meath.
Yes, famous ones.
Built around 3200 BC. They're actually older than the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Which is just mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And we also find smaller but equally intriguing dolmens. These huge stone structures like massive tables. Some were clearly oriented as astronomical observatories.
So not just tombs.
Seems not just tombs. All these remains, pits lined with palisades, huge stone circles, hilltop forts, they really point to a surprisingly rich cultural and social life way back then.
Okay, so how did this early society evolve? From around 2500 BC, people start refining copper and gold. But it's interesting that stone tools stick around right up until the Iron Age, around 600 BC.
Yeah, that overlap is quite long. And that Iron Age period marks Ireland's transition into history proper, as they say, with the emergence of indigenous written literature.
Right, writing starts. And there were increasing commercial contacts, too, with Britain, France.
Yes, and Brittany, especially in crafts like metalwork, stone carving. Trade networks were definitely developing.
So what can we say about the social structure, then? How is society organized?
Well, what becomes clear is that society grew increasingly stratified, layered. We see clear divisions emerging: kings, clergy, lords, free followers, clients, even servile classes.
A real hierarchy.
A real hierarchy, yeah. Defense and administration were organized tribally, and new types of settlements appeared, like those impressive rath-like hill forts.
Ring forts. You still see them everywhere.
Exactly, often protected by a mix of physical defenses and a good dose of superstition, too.
Huh. And what about the Onax? Hope I'm saying that right.
Pretty close. Onox. Owinex. Yeah, these were special occasions, big gatherings for business, games, horse racing. Their origins might even go back to ancient funerary games.
Fascinating. And then, arguably the most influential group, the Celts, move into Ireland. When was this?
During the second millennium BC, and what's really impactful about their arrival is how they added significant political structure.
How so?
Well, they established kingdoms with local, sort of temporary kings, but these were overseen by a rotating high king who, in theory, held sway over all of Ireland.
The sort of federal system, almost.
In a way, yeah. They fostered these rich local cultures and languages, but they still had enough collective identity to unite against external threats. Famously, they resisted invaders like the Romans Romans.
Who never actually conquered Ireland, which is a key point.
A very key point. And many Celtic customs, myths, practices, they survived. They created this complex, rigidly stratified society. The rules for interactions between classes were incredibly detailed, almost like the code of chivalry in medieval Europe. And this era also saw the precursors of Ireland's modern provinces, Ulaid, Connacht, Munster, emerging as tribal federations. Plus, you get the introduction of coinage and a more formal idea of kingship.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the arrival of Christianity. The popular story, the one many of us know, gives almost all the credit to the legendary St. Patrick in the 5th century.
Right, the narrative full of romance and drama, painting Patrick as this figure sweeping the land, getting rid of quote-unquote barbaric pagan ways.
Yeah, driving out the snakes, metaphorically or otherwise.
Exactly. But that narrative, while compelling, is where contemporary historiography gives us a much more nuanced view. The reality was far more complex, a gradual process.
So not an overnight conversion.
Definitely not. While St. Patrick's own writings, like his letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, certainly push for a clean break from paganism, the actual conversion was more like a meeting point.
A meeting point.
Yeah, where the two faiths, paganism and Christianity, they met, they adapted, and they even sort of licensed each other's traditions sometimes. This formed a new syncretic faith. Syncretic, meaning a blend.
A blend, exactly. A blending of different beliefs, often settling right on top of existing pagan worship patterns and sites.
Interesting. So from the latter half of the 5th century, this blending continues, and this distinctive Celtic vision of faith develops.
It does. It takes root in Ireland and then spreads to northern Britain. Over about 3 centuries, the Celtic Church became its own unique thing, a truly syncretic patchwork of late Roman, Irish, and pre-Christian practices.
And monasticism plays a huge role in this, right?
Oh, the impact of monasticism on Irish history and Christianity just cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
It was profound.
How so? What did these monasteries do?
Well, they developed into these intricate networks of foundation schools, church schools, managed by both lay people and scholars. This unique environment merged Christian learning with native styles.
Which was crucial for developing a written Irish language.
Absolutely crucial. And it also allowed pre-Christian myths and art to combine pretty seamlessly with Christian beliefs, preserving a vast cultural heritage that might otherwise have been lost.
Yeah.
These monastic centers, like the ones founded by St. Enda, St. Bridget, St. Finian, St. Columcille, they really propelled Ireland into an age of flourishing scholarship.
And the Ais Dana,
Good.
learned class.
Yes, the Stana these days, poets, historians, lawyers, they work directly with these monasteries, recording myths, laws, history, and annals. They preserve this huge body of knowledge.
Incredible preservation. Okay, next, we move into a more tumultuous period, the Viking Age, starting around 795 AD.
That's when the first recorded raids hit churches and monasteries, yeah. These Norsemen from Scandinavia, though, they weren't just raiders, they were also formidable traders.
Right, they established extensive routes.
Big time. Along the coasts of Europe. By the 9th century, Viking raids were, a regular feature along the Irish coast. And despite some Irish resistance initially, their presence led to the emergence of actual towns.
Like Dublin.
Exactly. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, these became important urban centers, really transforming how people lived and traded.
So they weren't just hit and run.
Not entirely. Norse settlers developed these intricate trade routes across Europe. They imported luxury items, ivory, silk, glass, spices from way off in Asia and the Middle East.
Wow. And exported.
Staples like cattle, furs, and unfortunately slaves too. The enduring impact of these piratical Norsemen, as some sources call them, it goes beyond just wealth. They ultimately shifted the balance of power.
They even ruled Dublin for a while.
They did, as a Viking kingdom, right up until 1169. And while King Brian Boru is celebrated for resisting them, his death at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 was more of a symbolic turning point than a decisive end to their influence.
Right. Okay, so that Viking presence sets the stage for another absolutely pivotal moment, the Norman invasion.
It kicks off in 1166. Dermot MacMurrough, the King of Leinster at the time, gets ousted and goes to King Henry II of England for help.
Asking for military aid.
Exactly. MacMurrough returns in August 1167 with some knights and archers, sort of laying the groundwork.
But the main force comes later.
Yes, August 1170. Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, arrives with around 2,200 troops.
That's a significant force.
A very significant force.
Yeah.
Their combined armies, with McMurrough, quickly take strategic targets like Waterford and Dublin. And the contrast in military tech was stark.
How so?
You had heavily armored Norman knights versus Irish warriors, often with little or no protective clothing. It was a mismatch in many ways.
Yeah, and there was
By 1171, Strongbow is effectively made King of Leinster, and then Henry II himself lands in Waterford. That really marks the beginning of a significant and obviously enduring English presence in Ireland.
It wasn't just a military conquest then. It fundamentally shifted Ireland's whole geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely.
And as feudalism, this Norman system, starts to take root in Anglo-Norman Ireland, how did the existing Irish kings and lords adapt, or did they?
Well, it was far from an easy transition, as you can imagine. The Norman system imposed these reciprocal obligations of vassalage owing service for land. It was quite different from the existing Irish tribal structures.
So, clash of systems.
A major clash. Reconciling the old order with this new hierarchical system was a challenge that took generations. And honestly, it was only ever partially accomplished, leaving this complex legacy of overlapping jurisdictions and loyalties that persisted for centuries.
Right. And this English influence only gets stronger during the Tudor conquest, starting around the 1530s with Henry VIII.
Yeah, Henry VIII, heavily influenced by Thomas Cromwell, had this strong desire to make Ireland a rigidly subordinate district of the English state. He proclaimed himself King of Ireland in 1541.
Before this, English control was mainly limited to the Pale around Dublin.
That's right, the English Pale. Beyond that, Gaelic forms of government survived relatively untouched for a long time. Henry wanted to change that, extending Dublin's governmental structure across the whole island.
And this period was marked by major conflicts, especially over religion.
Huge conflicts, yeah. Particularly as Protestantism was forcefully imposed upon the predominantly Catholic Irish population. And a really profound long-term impact came during Elizabeth I's reign with the Plantation of Ulster.
The plantations. Can you explain what that involved?
It was a systematic process. Protestant, Scottish, and English settlers were brought in to replace native Catholic landowners, particularly in the province of Ulster. This wasn't just about transferring land, it was a fundamental restructuring of society and demography.
Laying the groundwork for future conflict.
Absolutely. It laid the groundwork for centuries of sectarian conflict, the echoes of which are still felt.
And the devastation continued, didn't it? With the Cromwellian invasion of 1641.
Yes. Following Irish attacks on some of those settlers, there were ferocious reprisal attacks led by Cromwell's forces. It was brutal, so much so that by the 1650s, the Irish population in Ulster was halved.
Halved, goodness.
Yeah. Many were forced to flee to lands considered barren and inhospitable, which, ironically, as some sources note, became the heart of a new Ireland, fostering this resilient but deeply dispossessed identity.
And by the 18th century, the Protestant ascendancy consolidated its hold.
It did, solidified by enacting harsh anti-Catholic penal laws.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into that Cromwellian conquest in the 1640s. What really triggered such an intensely brutal campaign?
It was a complex mix, really. There was Irish dissatisfaction with government reforms coming from England, but that was compounded by deep religious animosity and, crucially, widespread land confiscation that had already been happening.
And Cromwell himself took command.
He did in 1649, leading to infamous massacres at Drogheda and Wexford. The scale and severity reportedly surpassed anything seen since Henry VIII's time.
And the ultimate impact. The so what of this campaign.
The profound so what was its policy, which sources describe as essentially religious and political extermination of Irish Catholics. Around 600,000 Catholics were reportedly killed or enslaved.
Enslaved?
Yes, with some accounts mentioning 60,000 even being sold into chattel slavery in Barbados. It decimated the Irish nobility and utterly reshaped the social and landowning landscape for centuries. A truly dark period.
Unbelievably harsh. And adding another layer of conflict was the Williamite War, 1689-1691. This was between James II and William of Orange.
That's right, fought largely on Irish soil. It culminated in the Battle of the Boyne on July 1st, 1690, a date still hugely significant today.
Where William's forces won decisively.
Overwhelmingly, yeah, leading to William and Mary gaining the English crown. But the key thing for Ireland was the aftermath.
The Treaty of Limerick.
Exactly, in 1691. Supposedly, it granted the defeated Irish Catholic forces and their allies rights to land, laws, and religion.
Supposedly.
Well, the tragic truth, according to historians, is that the vast majority of the treaty's articles protecting Catholic rights were violated shortly after.
Really? So the promises weren't kept?
Largely ignored or overturned by the Irish Parliament, which was dominated by the Protestant ascendancy. This breach of trust solidified that ascendancy's power for over a century and a half. It also ensured the partial exile of much of the remaining Irish Catholic nobility and clergy, deeply entrenching the power imbalance.
Which leads us directly to those penal laws you mentioned earlier, enacted mainly in the late 17th and early 18th centuries.
Yes, these laws were explicitly directed against the Catholic majority. And it's important to understand these weren't just laws against, say, specific crimes. They were systematic laws designed to dispossess and subjugate an entire people.
How did they work in practice?
Well, Catholic priests were banished. Catholics were stripped of their rights to practice law, inherit estates freely, vote, hold public office, even own a horse worth more than £5. Attendance at Protestant church services was technically mandatory, forcing Catholics to form underground parishes to preserve their faith in secret.
And the land confiscations tied into this.
Absolutely, especially in Ulster. By the end of the 17th century, estimates suggest a staggering 66%, maybe more, of the land was owned by new Protestant landlords. The impact on society and culture was just profound.
Rights, religion outlawed.
Formal education banned, except for secret hedge schools. One historical observation described the Irish peasantry becoming a nation of beggars, despoiled of their language, their customs, their dress, and their rights. It was an attempt, really, to erase an identity.
But it inadvertently fueled resistance.
Deeply. It fostered a deep-seated sense of grievance and resistance that would define Irish nationalism for centuries to come.
Now, fast-forwarding tragically to what's often called the single greatest tragedy in Irish history, the Great Famine, 1845 to 1851.
And Gortamore. Yes.
Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease in just 5 years because the potato crop failed due to blight. But, as the sources suggest, this wasn't purely a natural disaster.
No, it certainly wasn't just the blight. What's profoundly sobering and still debated is how human actions or inactions by the British government severely exacerbated the problem.
How so?
Well, despite widespread starvation, food like grain and livestock continued to be exported from Ireland, often under armed guard because market forces dictated it. There were arguments about interfering with trade, laissez-faire economics.
While people were starving.
While people were starving. Relief efforts were often slow, inadequate, and sometimes punitive, tied to things like the workhouse system. It led to this catastrophic demographic upheaval. 2 million people fled the country in that decade alone.
2 million?
At least. And the overall population fell by about a third, through death and emigration. It fundamentally reshaped Irish society. Land became this fear-laden commodity. It fostered a deeply cautious society where economic security became paramount.
And this triggered the greatest wave of emigration.
Yes. While emigration happened before, the famine kicked off the huge wave. From 1850 to 1910, maybe 3 million people left permanently.
Mostly to America.
Predominantly, yes. Cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago saw huge influxes. This massive exodus formed the bulk of the global Irish diaspora.
And their experience abroad.
A real mix, according to accounts. Immense tribulation, poverty, discrimination, but also resilience, community building, eventual success, and this complex process of carving out a new Irish-American identity, often bridging their Catholic heritage with a sometimes fiercely anti-Catholic society.
Then, in the early 20th century, these long simmering conflicts finally erupt into outright violence again. A key event being the 1916 Easter Rising.
A coordinated uprising, mainly in Dublin by the Irish Republican Brotherhood and other nationalist groups. Militarily, it was suppressed fairly quickly.
But its impact was much bigger than its military success.
Oh, far bigger. Despite the failure and the British government's controversial execution of its leaders, which turned them into martyrs almost overnight, the Rising had this profound catalyzing effect.
How?
It thrust the demand for full Irish independence right to the top of the public agenda, both in Ireland and internationally. It exposed many people, maybe for the first time, to the full force of nationalist thought and the demand for a republic.
Setting the stage for what came next.
Exactly. It set the stage for the rise of Sinn Féin as the dominant nationalist party, the Anglo-Irish War, or War of Independence, from 1919 to 1921. After World War I, Sinn Féin won a landslide majority of Irish seats in the British Parliament, refused to sit there, and instead declared an Irish Republic on January 21st, 1919.
Which brings us to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the subsequent, very bitter Irish Civil War, and the painful process of partition.
Yes. The treaty, signed in late 1921, offered Ireland dominion status within the British Empire, similar to Canada. But it required an oath of allegiance to the Crown and, crucially, allowed 6 counties in the northeast with Protestant Unionist majorities to opt out and remain part of the UK.
Dividing the nationalist movement.
Deeply, leading to the Irish Civil War between the pro-treaty forces who formed the government of the new Irish Free State and the anti-treaty IRA. It was short, but incredibly brutal, leaving deep scars and divisions in Irish politics for generations.
And Northern Ireland was created in 1921 as those 6 counties opted out. What were the complexities there?
Highly complex. The pro-British Ulster Unionists, the Protestant majority in those 6 counties, had vehemently demanded their own self-governing state within the UK. The borders were drawn, some say gerrymandered, to ensure a stable Unionist majority and retain control over industrial areas like Belfast and access to ports.
A British solution to an Irish problem.
That's how it's often described, yeah. The Government of Ireland Act led directly to this partition, creating a whole new set of long-term problems and challenges centered on identity, discrimination, and contested sovereignty.
And partition, inevitably it seems, birthed this new struggle of identity, often with a strong religious basis, becoming a catalyst for violent opposition to British authority in Northern Ireland, leading eventually to the Troubles.
Exactly, from roughly 1968 to 1998. The historical context, those earlier land confiscations, the penal laws, the sense of discrimination felt by the Catholic nationalist minority in Northern Ireland all continued to fuel the conflict. It was a complex ethno-nationalist conflict with deep historical roots.
And how was peace eventually achieved, or at least a framework for it?
After decades of violence and many failed initiatives, intense, high-level peace efforts involving the Irish and British governments, parties in Northern Ireland, and, crucially, the U.S., led to the Good Friday Agreement of April 10, 1998.
What did that agreement do?
It established complex power-sharing arrangements between Unionists and Nationalists within Northern Ireland, North-South cooperation bodies with the Republic of Ireland, and East-West links with Great Britain. It aimed to, as some put it, save metal and brick and mortar by creating political structures that acknowledged different identities.
But it didn't solve everything.
No. History has shown that while it brought an end to the widespread political violence, it couldn't fully abnegate Republican ambitions or completely resolve all the underlying identity issues and historical grievances. But, crucially, it provided a vital internationally backed framework for peace and future progress, even with its ongoing challenges.
Okay, so shifting focus to the Republic of Ireland. How has modern Ireland evolved from this incredibly tumultuous past? We see this remarkable economic transformation.
Truly remarkable. At the turn of the 20th century, Ireland was one of Europe's poorest countries. By the early 21st, it had become a highly developed nation, a member of the wealthy club of OECD countries.
And what drove that turnaround? The Celtic Tiger.
That period, roughly mid-1990s to 2007, was dubbed the Celtic Tiger. Yeah. Ireland experienced astonishingly fast economic growth. Several factors came together.
Such as?
A major one was attracting huge amounts of foreign direct investment, heavily influenced by a deliberately low corporation tax rate, 12.5%. That made it very attractive for multinational companies, especially from the U.S., looking for a European base.
Anything else?
Yes. Ireland also benefited from investments in education, creating a highly educated English-speaking workforce. Plus, EU membership provided access to markets and structural funds, and a stable, harmonized legal environment helped too.
Right. And alongside this economic boom, Ireland also experienced a significant cultural renaissance, particularly around the turn of the 20th century.
Yes, often called the Irish Revival, Celtic Twilight, or Irish Renaissance. These terms all point to this flowering of culture.
How did this cultural rebirth connect with the nation's political identity and nationalism?
Deeply intertwined. The very term Renaissance implies rebirth. Renewal carrying political weight alongside the cultural aspect. It saw this powerful, renewed interest in Irish language, mythology, history, literature, music, arts.
A rediscovery of heritage.
Exactly. From a nationalist viewpoint, it was seen as reclaiming a past glory, finding strength in a distinct Irish identity separate from Britain. Modernist views might emphasize it as finally recognizing an existing, but maybe undervalued, national tradition. Either way, it produced an astonishing body of notable literature. Yeats, Joyce, Synge poetry, scholarly works. It really made Ireland a hub of learning and creativity again, profoundly shaping its modern cultural identity.
And finally, let's touch on Ireland's journey into the European Union. Joining the EEC, as it was then back in 1973, what were the main drivers?
Primarily economic motivations, Ireland believed joining the European Economic Community offered huge opportunities for sustained, accelerated economic growth that it couldn't achieve alone.
What kind of opportunity?
Access to the common agricultural policy was massive for Irish farmers. It stimulated inward investment, as we discuss with the Celtic Tiger later on, and it opened up access to vast European markets for exports beyond just the UK.
So it marked a big shift from protectionism.
A fundamental shift towards a more liberalized, open economy. The significant benefits really started kicking in during the 1980s and early 1990s, laying more groundwork for the Celtic Tiger boom.
But have there been challenges too?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
While EU membership undeniably brought immense economic development, it also poses ongoing questions and challenges. Some argue rapid economic change can be socially corrosive if not managed carefully, risking things like increased inequality, strains on infrastructure, or concerns about sovereignty debates that continue in modern Ireland.
What an incredible, sweeping journey we've taken through Irish history. From those ancient Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the people who built those mind-boggling megalithic tombs,
Through the profound influences of the Celts, the arrival and unique shaping of Christianity.
to the tumultuous waves of Viking, Norman, and Tudor invasions, each leaving such a deep mark.
We've touched on centuries of conflict, intense religious strife, and devastating events like the Cromwellian conquest and, of course, the Great Famine, which shaped the people, led to that massive emigration and the global diaspora.
Yet through all of that, we've also seen this remarkable resilience, the tenacious, centuries-long fight for independence, culminating in the modern state.
And then its incredible economic and cultural transformation in recent decades into a highly developed modern EU nation today. It's quite a story.
It really is. So here's something to think about. How does a nation, one forged by such deep historical fault lines, partition, conflict, colonization, and one that endured such profound suffering like the famine, how does it manage to become, in some ways, a poster child for development?
While also maintaining such a rich, distinct cultural identity and this enduring connection to its often painful past.
Exactly. What lessons, maybe, does Ireland's long and complex journey offer us about the power of adaptation, the immense price of conflict, and perhaps the enduring nature of the human spirit when faced with really overwhelming odds?